But Baumrind identified two dimensions in talking about parenting styles. First, responsiveness. And that just means, like, are the parents seeing the child? Are they seeing the child's emotion? Are they seeing what the child needs or not? And are they aware of what the child's experience might be in an interaction? Doesn't mean the child gets his way, it just means the parents see the child and are responsive to it. The second dimension is demandingness or expectations. It's written in both ways. I think your book might say expectations, but it's the same thing. To what extent do the parents expect the child to behave, to respect others, to take responsibility, to work hard? Do they expect the child to do these things or not? And so when we compare different parenting styles on these two dimensions, we find out that some parents are more demanding than others, down here on the x-axis, and some parents are more responsive than others. And when we combine these two dimensions, we get these 4 parenting styles. Have you had this already in some psych class in the past? Not so much? Okay. Well, first off, we might have a permissive parent. And this parent is very responsive. See how high on this responsiveness dimension? Way up here on the top. But they're pretty low on demandingness. So that means they're not expecting much of their child. They're not necessarily expecting their child to work hard, or to learn, or to, apologize to grandma, or to obey the rules. And it ends up being a child-driven home where the parent is kind of doing what the child wants, but they're not stepping into their role as parent and taking leadership. And so there's not so many rules. So the parent loves the child, but the child never learns boundaries. And that can actually be something of an unsafe place for a child. I think every child, every child needs to know their boundaries and what's okay and what's not okay. And that gives a feeling of safety. So our second, let's go down to this parenting style, just the opposite. Authoritarian. We'll have to think of it in mind because you can see it's very similar to what's on top. Very demanding. The authoritarian parent has high expectations of their child. The child has to obey the rules. The child has to, make their bed. The child has to work hard at school and not get in trouble and sit still when they're in a restaurant, whatever it is. High expectations. But the thing is, it's low in responsiveness. Notice how low it is in responsiveness. And what that means is it's totally parent-driven. It means there's not a lot of talk about these things. The parent makes the rules, and regardless of what the child is experiencing, the child obeys those rules. And there's not a lot of conversation. Do what I say because I said so. And so it's a little bit punishment-driven, right? Strict rules and punishment for not obeying. And maybe not so much seeing the child for what they are, but seeing the child for how obediently they present themselves to the public. This parent would probably have a hard time, dealing with a child's tantrum in a public place and might resort to punishment. And so it ends up being authoritarian. Do what I say, obey me. We often find, because these children don't have much opportunity for exploration, they actually turn out to be more likely to break rules. When we look at moral development, we'll see that. More likely to break rules when there's a not someone pushing on them all the time, right? So it's not necessarily a good outcome. We do have parenting style infrequent, this is not common, who are neglectful or indifferent, it's called. They don't expect much of their child, and they're not in tune to their child. It might be someone who didn't want to have a child, or someone who's maybe struggling with their own needs at this time, maybe a need for an addiction, or maybe a single parent who's heavily involved in a new romance that can take away from attention to the child. And so mostly this parent would be considered kind of indifferent to their child needs, just not involved. And so because they're indifferent, they mostly interfere with what the child's doing if that behavior impacts them. Okay, so there's not a consistent set of rules and guidelines. It's just hey, if you're getting in my way, I'm going to punish you. It's more like that. And it's not a very common parenting style. And so then we come to this one that tends to be the most effective, which is high in responsiveness, but also high in expectations. And so when there's an issue, the authoritative parent, very easy to get those confused. The authoritative parent, well, is definitely going to intervene if the child's riding their bike in the road or something, right? You have to make the child safe. But it's not just going to be like, I'm taking your bike away and you're never getting it back, right? Because the child has to learn something in the exchange. Because in the end, remember what we want. We don't want a child who always has to be disciplined by someone else. That child will end up in jail because they're violating the law every time nobody's making them obey the law, right? We want to raise a child who knows what the right thing to do is and why that should be done. You know, so that's what this authoritative style does. It has clear rules and expectations, but it's got open communication. And then what do we mean by natural consequences? What do you suppose that's about?
Allowing the child to like experience the consequences on their own rather than like doling out consequences.
Okay, so you're allowed to, anyone want to add to that? It's a good description. You're allowing your child to experience the consequences of their actions. Or maybe we have an example. So the child is roughhousing. Oh, this happened to me when I was a kid, actually. My grandpa had a pool table in the basement, and my brother and I were goofing around, and I don't know what we were doing, but we broke his pool cue. What's the natural consequence? What naturally happens if you break something that belongs to someone else? What's the natural consequence?
Punishment.
Well, the natural consequence isn't naturally what happens when you break something is you get a spanking. Like that's not a natural consequence, right? That's an unnatural opposed consequence. What's the natural consequence? What if, just now, Hope gets up and she steps on Felicia's backpack and tears it. Like, what is she likely to do?
Oh, apologize.
Apologize? And maybe even if it's a serious thing, get her a new one or, something, right? You're going to make up for it. And that's in that pool cue case. I remember still to this day going to the bank with our little $10 savings accounts and drawing out $2 each and buying grandpa a new pool cue and taking it over to him. Anyhow, that's what a natural consequence is. Right? And sometimes they're hard. Like, what's the natural consequence of hitting your brother? Maybe. I mean, hopefully not. Maybe your brother has better mechanisms for coping with things. It's hard though, right? What's the natural consequence? Because siblings aren't like that, right? So sometimes you have to talk about the natural consequences, right? Like, what's going to happen if you always hit your brother? Is your brother going to give you the thing you want? Is your brother going to trust you? Is your brother still going to play with you that fun game that you like? Like, maybe that's the kind of thing it involves talk. What happens to your relationship? Any comments on this? We can always take it easy. Okay. This is an interesting one. So how do parents parent? Let me just roll back since I didn't phase this in. Who's parenting here? Anyone in the room besides Felicia? Okay, I see Rolana. I know some of you on Zoom are parents. So how did you learn how to parent? Anyone?
Their parent?
Yeah, we tend to parent how we were parented, right? That's all we know. Unless, we went to college and learned a whole bunch of stuff and we're trying to do things differently, right? But do you know what happens even when you try to do things differently because you've learned something? when you're under cognitive load, a great deal of stress, you tend to default back to the things that are easiest, which are the things you grew up with. So it takes a lot of cognitive discipline for parents to shift what they were raised with their own, when they were children. And so that's what the point of this next slide is. How do parents parent? It's hard. It's easy to apply those new parenting strategies if you decide you want to parent a little differently. It's easy to apply when you're not under stress. It's hard to apply when you're under stress. So it takes a lot of parent discipline. And there are these differences, your book pointed these out, that we have differences that are accorded to what is expected of the parents in the world. And it tends to be that people who are in the working class, like you have a job, like you have, many of you have probably had a job at some point that involves like getting to work on time. That's a big deal, right? Like first job I had working in the pharmacy, getting to work on time, a big deal. And then like listening to what the boss said, big deal, right? And maybe, what else am I saying here? Oh yeah, being honest, right? Coming in every time it's your shift. Those are the things that are valued, that some parents, that's what makes them successful in life, those things. And so that's what they want in their children. But professional parents, what are they rewarding? Like if you're a doctor or a lawyer or, an architect, or, you're just working a profession that relies on education. Well, you're rewarded for acting independently, for stepping up, taking the initiative, for creative solutions to problems, for managing your own time, right? When you're a professional, nobody's telling you to clock in at a certain time. It's up to you to get the job done. You manage your own time very often. I mean, you have to go to appointments, but I mean, overall, it's up to you to get the job done. And so what do they want in their children? They want their, what? They want their kids to discuss the rules, probably, right? Come up with a logical argument. Why is there a curfew? I think that I could be right. That's what they want. They want their parents, they want their kids to show independence, to show initiative, to show leadership. So does that kind of make sense? Like you could see how these different values. I worked back in the days when I taught K-12, I worked in both kinds of schools, and boy, the difference was striking. And I'd never worked with kids who were taught that obedience was a primary, goal. And it was a very different experience. In fact, it was very hard to get the kids to like ask questions or, offer up a different view or take a leadership role. Like it was a challenge because they had been taught obedience to authority. And as their teacher, I was the authority. And it was kind of nice, but at the same time, it was disconcerting because I had worked with a very different type of child. Now let's imagine this scenario, this last tiny bullet point beginning with sometimes. What if you delay your family? You don't start your family till you're much older. You have an education, you know a lot more, you marry someone, and you decide you're going to raise your kids differently than you were raised for whatever reason. How's that going to feel when you go visit do you think it could be awkward? Your parents might be expecting your kids to have those same characteristics, to not ask questions, right? To obey authority. I mean, not that we shouldn't obey authority, but blind obedience isn't necessarily the best thing, because what if the authority is telling you to do something harmful, which there's a lot of studies in psychology. So that's something to think about. How do you navigate that? Okay, a little bit on physical punishment and a couple more examples. We don't have support and research for physical punishment, even though maybe many of you and many of the people standing in this row have probably been spanked. So the research at this time doesn't support the use of physical punishment as a good parenting technique. Just a little bit, this is directly from your book actually, a longitudinal study and a lot of families and a lot of different regions. And they found that there were some outcomes that longitudinal means, remember, over many years. And so what were the outcomes of mothers who spanked 2 or more times a week? Those children were significantly more aggressive and broke more rules than children who were not spanked. So just, and even if it was less than that, spanked by mom, still those 2 things were higher in those kids. And let's just contemplate for a minute why this would possibly be.
The mother shows that physical aggression is the solution to it.
Okay, we might have modeling. If you're not getting what you want, then the way to solve that problem is physical aggression. And let me pose another question then. What's the alternative to physical aggression when you're running into trouble? Okay, go up. Yeah, go ahead. Someone's speaking on Zoom. Heard a voice. I know it's it. Okay, so let's imagine that there's Stephanie. Let's imagine that I want something that Stephanie has, and there's 2 ways I can get it. It's easier to demonstrate in the classroom here, so let's pretend that I want, aren't you glad you sat up front? Let's say that I want her drink, all right? There's 2 ways I can get it, right? I can go up to her and say, oh, I want your drink, and take it, right? Or I can say, hey, Darian, could I have a little sip of your drink? I could use my words, right? So do you see the implicit message? I mean, I'm kind of joking that, like, what's the alternative to physical violence? It's talking. What do you remember most about authoritative parenting as opposed to authoritarian? What do authoritative parents do a lot more of?
Communicating.
Talking. And by the way, I'll add, it's not in this slide, but I might have it coming up, not today, but in another class. Parents who use authoritative methods also tend to give a lot more positive responses to their kids. If we just count the number of words, like, oh, well done, oh, nice job, things like that, as opposed to stop, don't, negative feedback. All right, and the same thing was true here of fathers. You saw this in your book probably. This time they tended to be, if they were spanked by their fathers more than twice a week, they tended to be lower out of a vocabulary test. Now that becomes obvious why, right? Because there hasn't been the engagement of language to help them learn. It's been coercion, force. I'll make you do it. But that's kind of a weak stand because a parent is a lot bigger and stronger than a child. So we just talked about the why. And then what else? Just a few tips here. Of course, finding when the child does the right thing and praising it. There's some question about praising. Modeling it. You just talked about that. Yeah, go ahead.
This relates to the last slide, but what do you think about parents who use their words to threaten those type of emotions?
Like, it's called love withdrawal. And there's a model of, there's a parenting model that talks about that, like coercive parenting, which is like a power play. I'm bigger than, stronger than you, and I'll make you do it. And it doesn't even have to be physically bigger and stronger. It can be just in a power position. Like, I've got the keys to the car. You can't have them, right? I have the money. So power play, that's coercive parenting. And then there's the love withdrawal parenting, which is like kind of rejecting the child emotionally when they're not doing what you want. And that also has quite harmful effects, actually. It can really violate a child's sense of safety. Like, in some ways, the physical violence might be even easier for the child to deal with, because this emotional rejection, that can stay with that child emotionally for quite a long time. And then, of course, the last is this engaged language-based parenting model. It's just another parenting model. It's Patterson, I think, is the researcher on it. But they definitely found that the love withdrawal was a kind of a dangerous. What would that look like, love withdrawal? The child just, got mad at you and knocked your beverage over on purpose. What does love withdrawal look like?
child is like severely upset, like they have like tears in their eyes and they're crying, and they're trying to like come to the parent for comfort, but as punishment, the parent like pushes away the child or like goes back away from the child and just leaves them.
A more realistic version of that would be the child coming to the parent with a concerning, emotional problem that may look bad for the family entirely. And the parent could say, stop doing that. It makes us look bad. Or even saying something like, do you not love me? And then, or just completely dismissing why they would do that, why they acted based on that type of emotion.
I think both of those are pretty good examples. Like, because in both cases, the child feels rejected for their behavior. And now we can reject a child's behavior without rejecting the child. So within the discipline that we're getting, there has to be an underlying feeling for that child, that love is steady. It's hard if you're angry as a parent, right? And so we'll get to talking about your own emotions. Like if you do find yourself getting angry, it's a human emotion. You can tell your child, before when you did that, I felt really angry, and that's why I went into the bedroom for a little while, because I didn't want to feel angry when I talked to you. But later on, right, after the emotions start talking about these things. And a couple of those alternatives, the modeling, giving choices and choosing your battles, right? What's really important? Is it really important that they put their pillow on the bed or whatever? Or are there bigger things you want to focus on? There is the timeout thing, withdrawing privileges, and there's also this interesting one. Where do I have it here? It's called time in, and it's not this last one, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's actually, it's here somewhere, but it's actually involves like, when your child is that upset and does something wrong, like you just sit there and hold them until their bodies calm down. And then you can talk to them, but you're not rejecting them while they're in their tantrum. You're just calmly keeping your hands up, which is interesting. My daughter does something that I kind of like too. She has a child who's a little bit on the autism spectrum. And so she has a difficulty with transitions. And so when she cries, my daughter says something like, oh, you need to cry, that's okay. Do you need to cry a little bit more before you're done? And it's very effective for her, because sometimes the child will say, yes, I need to cry a little more, which is really good introspection, right? Yes. And then she'll cry a little more and it'll be kind of fake and then it'll be over. And it's a compassionate statement. It's not sarcastic. So I think that's why it's effective. And then the very last on this, let me just see here. Okay, no, we're going to talk about this more in a minute. First, I have a couple examples here from Baumrind. All right.